Hi, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm at the Flame University in Pune, where the Law, Economics and Policy Conference is taking place. This is organized, of course, by the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I'm in conversation with Professor Ashwini Deshpande, who's a professor of economics at Ashoka University. You were talking at the conference and you were speaking about the fall in participation of women in the labor force. Could you illustrate that for us, explain how that has panned out and why there has been such a big decline?
So I think there are two issues that we need to be mindful of. One is the level of female labor force participation rates, and the other is the decline. Now, when you look at the level of female labor force participation rates, even at its peak, the recorded female labor force participation rate never exceeded 40%, 38% mostly. And within this aggregate category, you found that SC/ST women, that women from the marginalized sections that have fewer taboos on working for wages and for whom economic compulsion basically dictates that they must work, they always had higher labor force participation rates than upper caste Hindu women for whom working for wages was seen as a marker of low status, and so they would not do that. So even when the rate was at its highest, there were these very important differences. And the reason the differences are important is because when you now look at the decline, the decline has been in rural India, not in urban India, which always had lower than rural participation rates. Secondly, within rural India, it's the tribal women, the Adivasi women, the ST women that have recorded the largest decline. So what this suggests is that women who are at the lower end of the occupational spectrum, who are working already in very precarious employment, they have somehow been rendered more vulnerable and their labor force participation rates have declined. So I don't think this can be interpreted as them voluntarily exiting the workforce because they don't have any taboos. Second, they cannot afford to voluntarily exit from the workforce. So that's why we need to dig a little bit deeper and carefully into what does the decline really represent.
Is this something, so as I understand it, this is something that has played out since 2004 and particularly over the last couple of decades. The COVID-19 shock, did that also contribute to a large part of this?
So a lot of the analysis is pre-COVID, so that you don't say that, oh, it's COVID that did it, right? And so the decline is pre-COVID, for sure. What happened during COVID is that the first lockdown, and I have a paper on that, showed that both men and women's employment suffered because it was complete lockdown, but women's employment suffered disproportionately more. However, as we unlocked the economy and as economic activity started to climb back towards its pre-COVID phase, the workforce participation rates have more or less gone back to the earlier level. So that now we are back to sort of where we were in 2019, in some sense, broadly speaking. But the decline from 2004 to 19 is still something that we need to talk about, right?
What is that? You've clearly pointed out that it's not the taboo of going to work. It is the fact that there aren't jobs. Is that the main reason?
So the academic literature on this question focuses on the inability of women to supply their labor, either because they have conservative families or they themselves are conservative, or they are afraid of street violence, they are afraid of sexual harassment, and all these kinds of things. These are what the economists call the supply side reasons. And all of these factors in themselves are very important. Obviously, sexual harassment is a problem. Obviously, we need safer streets. Obviously, we need transportation. There is no doubt that all of these factors are important. But when you think of the decline, I don't think that these explanations explain the decline. What we find in my paper with Jitendra Singh, my student at Ashoka University, is that as the agriculture was the biggest employer of women, so more than 80% of female employment was in agriculture. It still continues to be the biggest employer for women. But the contribution of agriculture in total employment has shrunk, as is inevitable with structural change. So services now contributes much more to GDP than agriculture does, as has happened everywhere in the world. That's just the way economies have progressed. But the employment growth in services has not kept pace with this contribution to GDP. So while it contributes a lot to GDP, it doesn't necessarily result in those many jobs. And so when women's employment in agriculture falls, it doesn't get automatically picked up by services, which are anyway urban, not so much rural. So in rural India, you find that the availability of farming possibilities jobs has declined. Mechanization has displaced female labor more than it has displaced male labor. And in rural India, the only jobs that women can do are, Asha Anganwadi, healthcare workers, school teachers, maybe, set up a shop or two. But the avenues for non-farm rural employment are few and far between, both for men and women. But it affects women disproportionately more.
So then what is, if at all, the policy response for that? Because on the one hand, there is clearly a problem. On the other hand, you're talking about the possibility of, and a lot of, I think people in policy are talking about the private sector creating jobs. But is there going to be a significant gulf that may not be bridged by the private sector?
So the private sector jobs, to begin with, to the extent that they happen, will happen in urban areas first. I mean, rural India is beset with infrastructural problems, market of problem of transportation. Even if something gets produced there, how are you going to run? So it needs a much larger infrastructural push to bring, large scale manufacturing employment, for example, to rural India. But see what China did. China was also a country that had a large population. And so providing gainful employment to its workers was a policy priority. And China had low productivity manufacturing enterprises in rural China that produce all these plasticky things that we consume, even in India. So these are township and village enterprises that are not very high productivity, not very, very capital intensive, but they provide employment and they produce goods that can be produced with low level of equipment, etc. So I think that we need as a country to think about how we can promote and push non-farm work availability in rural India. Take, for example, food processing. That can be a huge possibility where you can just process foods that are local, and India has a huge diversity of products. But then the question is, where's refrigeration? Where will you keep it? Where will you store it? How will it transport to the cities? What are the marketing networks? So I think, but there are solutions to each of these problems. But I think we first need to not be in denial. And we first need to recognize that rural India is where the new set of jobs will have to be created. And going back to agriculture is not the option. I mean, during COVID, agriculture provided the sort of refuge of last sort because the resort and it provided the buffer, which was thank goodness for that. But that is not the solution for a growing India moving forward that aims to be, 5 trillion or 8 trillion economy. I think we need to think of, because unlike in the West, one of India's features, which could become its strength, is a huge manpower.
Yes. And demographic dividend.
Demographic dividend, but it's not a dividend right now.
Yes.
So if there are young people who are not employed, that's not a dividend. That's a cost. Yes. So how do you convert the demography into a dividend? That is when you employ the huge resource of human power, both male and female, into the economy. Like Mao Zedong said, women hold up half the sky. And if 50% of your population is disproportionately unemployed or not gainfully employed, that can't be the recipe for a modern growing economy.
True. And on that note, and it leaves us, I think, with a lot to think about. But on that note, thank you so much, Professor Ashwini, for speaking to BQ Prime.
Thank you for talking to me. Thank you.